Some of you might remember a TV show that was on in the 1980s called The Wonder Years. It's been on in reruns. You might have seen it that way. And in that series, it's looking at the events of the late 60s and early 70s through the eyes of a 12-year-old boy who was living those years. The narrator is adult Kevin, but he's looking at the events of the 60s and 70s through the eyes of his 12-year-old self. So in the first episode, he gets the news that his girlfriend Winnie's brother has been killed in Vietnam, and he has to navigate what that means and how it feels and what his girlfriend is feeling and what their family's going through. And I watched that while it was on, and I enjoyed it. So I've been interested to see that ABC has just recently started a new series called The Wonder Years again. But this time, it's the story of another 12-year-old boy. His name is Dean, and he lives in Montgomery, Alabama with his family. His family's African American. They're looking at the same events, the same kinds of events, the late 60s, early 70s, but this time we get to look at those events through a very different perspective. So in this case, the first episode is this 12-year-old Dean trying to organize the first integrated baseball game between his team and his friend Brad's team. So we're looking at the same events through a different window. And that's what we're trying to do with this Advent series, Windows on Advent. And today we want to look through the window of wonder. And we do that by looking at the first chapter of Luke, where we see several different scenes, several different perspectives on a similar story. I like to call it two scenes and a song. So let's get to scene one. We look at scene one, and we see into the window of the temple. Zechariah is the character. He's in the temple because his line of priests has been called up for duty that week. We know a little bit about Zechariah. He's married. He has a wife named Elizabeth. They're both from the priestly line of Aaron. They're both blameless. They're keeping the law. They're keeping all the commandments. I mean, it sounds good, right? Everything sounds good. But they had one problem, and their problem was this. They did not have a child. They had prayed for a child for many years, but it never happened. Elizabeth was unable to conceive. And when we join this scene, when we look in this window on this day, it's not going to happen. Elizabeth is too old now to have a child. So there's Zechariah on duty. He's lighting the incense. He's saying the prayers. He's participating in the sacrifices. And the last thing he would have done that day is after the evening sacrifice, he would have gone back, lit the incense, and then gone outside where other people were gathered to pray. And he would have walked out and given them that blessing that we know from the Old Testament. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you. The Lord lift up his countenance on you. The Lord be gracious unto you. The Lord give you peace. But this day, something else happened. While Zechariah is in the temple, we're looking in that window, while he's there, an angel appeared right there, right by the incense altar where he was. And he was understandably afraid. He was terrified, some versions of this text tell us. He was obviously not expecting an angel to show up, and certainly not expecting the angel's message, which was, you are going to have a son. Now, Zechariah already knew that was impossible. The time had passed. It couldn't happen. So he asked a question that sounds very reasonable to me. How can I be sure? And while that sounds like a reasonable question, I think we have to think of it as a question really of cynicism. We're looking through the window of wonder today, but we have to consider, because of Zechariah, we have to consider the opposite of wonder, which is cynicism. Wonder is cynicism with tunnel vision. So if you are trying to imagine it, if you need a posture, if you need a reminder of it, cynicism is kind of like this. Zechariah is looking down the tunnel, hearing the angel's words, but he can't see it. All he can see through his tunnel vision is, no, that can't be true. That can't be right. It can't happen. That can't happen. We know it's impossible. We've prayed. We've been disappointed. We've been disappointed every time. That's cynicism. It's wonder. I want to believe, but I can't because I know it's impossible. So let's just leave Zechariah right there for just a minute. We want to look at this other window, which is the window in Nazareth. I think it's an ordinary house. We don't know for sure. I don't even know if it was a house, really. We look through a window, though. We can imagine the scene of looking in a window of a house, just an ordinary house in Nazareth, and there's a young girl there. And when I say young, I mean really young, probably 13, maybe even 12. And we don't know anything about her. On this side of history, we do know something. We know this is Mary because we know the story. But if you just read the text, her name is actually the last thing we find out about her. All we know is that she's a young woman, a virgin. She's betrothed to Joseph, and she lives in Nazareth. And then we find out, sort of on the side, that her name is Mary. And the same thing happens, a very similar thing happens. An angel appears, and she's also very disturbed, afraid, frightened, and the same message comes across. It's this crazy message that you're going to have a child, which was impossible, and he's going to be the Savior, the promised Messiah. And Mary also had a question. Her question was a little different, though. It sounds similar, but it's a little bit different. Zechariah, remember, asked, "How can I be sure?" Mary asked, "How can this happen? How will this happen?" So Zechariah's posture was, no, that can't be true. That can't be true. Mary's posture was more like this. Okay, how are you going to accomplish that? Different. It's different, right? It's a little bit different. Those two stories, we tell these two stories every year at Christmas. We look through these very same windows every single year at Christmas. I think it's because those questions, their questions, are just sort of gut level questions that we ask all the time. If you've ever been in a situation where you thought, well, I want to believe, I want to think this is true, but I've prayed so many times, I've tried so many times, I've been disappointed so many times, then you recognize that posture of Zechariah. Or if you've ever just been caught by surprise and you're like, wait, what? You want me to do what? Then you recognize that posture of Mary. It's two stories, two windows, two perspectives, two postures. What a difference. And we need to go back and pick up both stories to see the end, to see the result. So we go back, we look back through that window at Zechariah. The angel has left, and he's alone again in the temple. But the difference is he's lost his voice. Now, it doesn't sound all that bad, really, on the surface when you read it. I mean, he can't go outside and go, guys, you are never going to believe what just happened in there. It's really more than that, though. Do you remember that there were people outside the temple praying? They were waiting for the priest, the representative of God, to come out and give them the blessing. They were waiting for someone to come and say to them, the Lord look at you. God is looking at you with great love. God's face is lighting up when he sees you. And Zechariah couldn't do it. He couldn't go out. He couldn't bless anyone else because he was stuck in his own disbelief, cynicism. And of course, Mary's story, we know how it ends. She becomes, just by that simple obedience, she becomes the avenue, the venue through which, the person through which God blesses the entire world. So every year we read those stories. Every year we talk about them. We know how they end. Today might be a good question to ask ourselves another question. Why would Luke tell these stories? Why would he start this great story of Jesus with a speechless priest and a nameless girl? I think it's because all of us have been there. Their questions resonate with us. Anyone who's ever thought it was too late for God to do something for them, anyone who's ever thought, well, that's fine, but God doesn't deliver to my zip code, their questions resonate with us. And their stories tell us three important things about God. Here's the first one. God shows up in crazy places. Zechariah was in the temple, sure, that's where you would expect an angel to show up, but he wasn't expecting it that day. He wasn't expecting it because it was too late for him, because he knew that it couldn't happen, except, of course, it did. No one expected an angel to show up in Nazareth. No one expected anything good to happen in Nazareth, and mostly it didn't, until that one time when God showed up. God shows up in all kinds of places. You read the Bible, he shows up in the Garden of Eden, of course, but also in the desert, in a burning bush, in the lives of people who there's no reason for us to believe that God would use them or bless them or make them what they became. God shows up in all kinds of places, in hospital rooms and chemo centers, in food pantries, maybe even where you are today. I think the second thing their stories tell us is God shows up for ordinary people. Both the windows we've looked through today have really just been the lives of ordinary people. Zechariah was a priest, but he wasn't the high priest. He was just one of a whole bunch of priests who happened to be on duty that day. Mary was just one of all the girls in Israel who were wondering how God would send the Messiah, which one would be the Messiah. But there was no reason for her to think it would be her. If you read the Bible, if you think about every Bible story you've ever heard, if you think about every testimony you've ever heard, they're mostly people who really didn't have anything going for them. If you've ever said, I'm too young, or I'm too old, or I'm not good enough, or strong enough, or qualified enough, or whatever enough, well, neither were Zechariah or Mary, but God used them anyway. If you've ever thought it was too late, it was too late for Zechariah, or too early. It was too early for Mary. But here are these stories that we keep telling each other because they're good news for us. Here's the third thing. When God shows up, he turns everything upside down. So for that, we've had two scenes, and now we need the song. If you have your Bible, or if you're listening, toward the end of the first chapter, after the angel leaves Mary, she goes and visits her cousin Elizabeth, who is by this time pregnant. Mary goes to visit her, and they have this great joyous moment when both of them realize that a miracle has happened and they're part of it. So when we get to this window, we're not going to look in so much as listen in, because Mary sings this song that we call the Magnificat. It's starting at verse 46, and she says these things: "My soul glorifies the Lord." And she talks about how God's mercy extends to those who fear him. And then she says this: "He has performed mighty deeds. He has scattered the proud. He has brought down rulers from their thrones. He's lifted up the humble. He's filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. He has done what he said he would do. He has remembered his promises to us, and he has done exactly what he said he would do." And that's a great song, except that none of it had happened yet. When we're listening to this song from Mary that day, none of those things had happened yet. They were all still off in the future. The Romans were still ruling over Israel. The rich were still getting richer by exploiting the poor. The hungry were still hungry. But because of a simple act of obedience and faith, that posture of, okay, how will you make this happen? Mary could look at the future and celebrate it before it happened. That's faith. That's wonder. So today, I think these two questions, these two windows, two questions, the song, leave us with some questions of our own. I don't know where you are today. Not physically. I don't know where you are physically. You might be at your core. You might be just at home watching on your couch. That's not really the question. It's, where are you in your life right now? Where are you in your faith right now? Are you able to look at the future and celebrate it now? Are you able to say, okay, how will you do that? Or are you still stuck in, I don't know, I can't see it, I don't know, I'm afraid? What's your song today? What song are you singing? The one of fear and unbelief, or the one of faith that believes, that sees the future before it happens? If someone looked in the window of your life today, what would they see?